Hello, I'm Carolyn Carter, a proud member of the Women's Forum of New York, a past director of IWF, and past president of the President's Council. I'm delighted to take part in the IWF webinar series that brings us together virtually when a global pandemic is preventing us from meeting personally. These IWF webinars keep our forum magic alive, the magic of members inspiring and informing other members on issues that are important to all of us. These webcasts, which are seen by over 30 countries and hundreds of members, keep us all inspired and all informed. And certainly COVID-19 is one of the issues that we are all concerned about. Its unprecedented challenges are critical to us as individuals, as families, as communities, as business leaders. That's why I'm really pleased to share this conversation with another member of the Women's Forum of New York, Susan Silbermann of Pfizer, a company that is on the COVID frontline. Susan is president of emerging markets. She was formerly president of the global vaccine business, and most recently, she's been appointed head of Pfizer's COVID-19 task force. So there's a lot to talk about, and we know that Q&A is going to be very important, but we need to set some parameters before we start. First of all, Susan is not a scientist and she is not a doctor. So no technical questions about special formulas and no requests for medical advice, please. What she is an expert in helping business leaders understand the impact of COVID-19 and the race to respond, the race for a vaccine, the race for treatment, and the urgency in bringing people back to work. This is a candid member-to-member conversation. It's not a media interview, so the content should not be repurposed as such. And the last housekeeping point is, if you'd like to ask a question, just press the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. We've targeted about 40 minutes of conversation and 20 minutes for questions. And the next thing I'd like to do is welcome Susan Silbermann. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Carolyn, and hello, everyone from all around the world. I've been watching the chat boxes come in, and this is truly an international forum. So thank you all for joining, and I hope this provides some insight for all of you today.
As a little stage setting, Susan, let's start with your latest assignment. Let's talk about the COVID-19 task force you're leading at Pfizer. What is the scope of the task force?
So let me start from January. As Carolyn mentioned, not only am I the head of the task force at Pfizer, I run our business in what we call emerging markets. So that's Asia, including China, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. And I was asked in January, I actually was in China in January, and the disease was starting to crop up. It sounded like a flu. It was in a certain part of China where we happen to have a fairly large organization. And since I'm responsible for Asia, at the end of January, I had come back from China. Things were obviously getting bad there. And I was tapped on the shoulder to lead the task force, thinking that, it was probably part of my job because it was going to be something that was going to occur in the region of the world that I was responsible for. Well, that didn't last very long. As you all know, this is a global pandemic. It wasn't that in January. It wasn't called that in January, but it was headed in that direction as a disease that has now been deemed COVID-19. It's a SARS-CoV-2, to be more specific. And it is not just transmissible, but it's severe, which makes it quite different from some of the other pandemics that we've had over the years. Many of you might be familiar with H1N1, which was a flu virus. There was also SARS-CoV-1, or just called SARS, and that was confined to Southern Asia. And then there was MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. So the task force really got into gear at the end of January. I continued to travel, as many of you might have as well. And in fact, it really hit home for me in the beginning of February when I had been on a trip through Indonesia and traveled back through Singapore. And when I came through the Singapore airport on my way home to the US, I got pulled over by the Singapore Ministry of Health, asked where I had been in China, when I had been in China, not Indonesia, China, which was on my passport from the month prior, asked if I had had any fever, if I had not felt well, where I had stayed in Singapore, if I had stayed in Singapore. So it really hit home to me that this was going to be a big issue. So we put together a task force over the first parts of February, and it included colleagues from all over our company, mainly focusing on 6 areas: employee safety and well-being, and you'll hear me talk about that a lot because that's been the primary driver of all the work that we've done, but also continuing our supply of needed products and vaccines, focused on business continuity and innovation, since we feel our role in educating healthcare professionals around the world is so important. Making sure that we were looking at the science, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and what we could contribute as a major R&D player in medicines and vaccines. And then 2 other areas, including what we could do from a philanthropic point of view, and then what we needed to do from a communication standpoint.
You brought up a really interesting point. I mean, you've got all of this focus on COVID, but Pfizer has customers and patients that rely on medications for many, many things besides COVID. So what are the steps you're taking to balance your business so you make sure that you're taking care of those patients while all the effort is going on against the global pandemic?
Well, we've done a lot on the area of supply and business continuity. And one of the things that we did early on was made sure that we had a good scientific review of our portfolio to try and increase the inventory of products we thought might be useful during a pandemic infectious disease. And we have a large hospital portfolio that is very useful, but at the same time, making sure that we had enough stock for conditions that weren't going to go away. So if you have rheumatoid arthritis and you need your rheumatoid arthritis medicine, we didn't want it to be in short supply because we were focused on hospital medicine. So we did keep our manufacturing sites open, whereas many of us, including me, have been working from a remote location for actually many months now. Our manufacturing colleagues, a big chunk of them, were going to work every day to make sure that we didn't miss a beat. Now, what's interesting is when you read the literature, you see that a lot of people were just not going to the doctor. So we were trying our best to fill some of those gaps where we could for delivering, for example, in some countries, delivering refill prescriptions directly to patients' home, where that is allowed in countries around the world. So it's been a delicate balance. But I actually even spoke to my own doctor a few weeks ago, who's been working, doing virtual visits. And she said it's ironic. She doesn't know what happened to all the people that have back pain and can't sleep and have had even appendicitis. They seem to have dried up and disappeared. I think it's more that people have been self-medicating and self-treating.
Well, let's turn to the key to reclaiming normal for all of us and getting our lives back, which is the race for the vaccine. Tell us about the kinds of vaccines that are being explored for COVID-19.
So, without, again, I want to spring off what Carolyn said. I'm not a doctor. I am not a medical expert. I've been working in the pharma industry for many decades. So sometimes I feel like I play that on TV. I'm not on TV today. So I'm going to give you a little bit, though, of Vaccines 101. I know there are people on the call from all over the world. There may be a vaccines expert, there may be a medical doctor. So please excuse me. I try and use terms that I used to say I would say to my 7-year-old niece. So let's remember that what vaccines do is allow our bodies to do what it does best, which is fight off foreign pathogens, or let's just call them foreign invaders, something that gets into our system that shouldn't be there. Our body has an innate sense, most people do, an innate sense of saying, hey, you're not supposed to be here. We're going to fight you off and we're going to get you out of the system as quickly as possible. Vaccines basically help your body do just that. So in the case of bacterial infections, or in the case of COVID-19, a viral infection, a foreign particle known as an antigen enters your body, and it may or may not be able to be fought off. The situation with COVID and what we have right now is a novel viral pathogen, something that's never been seen in humans before. And so there are a lot of different approaches you can take to make a vaccine that works. So in the case of COVID, there are basically four approaches that are being used to look at how to tackle this in a vaccine. One is called an inactivated viral vaccine. It's similar to the way the polio and the measles vaccines were created. You actually take the virus itself, you weaken it, you introduce it into a vaccine, you introduce it into the body, and then the body creates these fighters, these antibodies that basically eliminate the problem, the pathogen. So that's one way, and that's one method, and that's being done in many of the companies. There are 5 actually vaccines in human trials in China, and they're all using this inactivated vaccine approach. There's another approach called viral vector vaccines, and that's where you genetically engineer the virus itself, and you insert that into the body to, again, have the body produce the antibodies to get rid of it. That is the approach that's being used by the vaccine that's being developed out of Oxford University that many of you might have heard of in conjunction with AstraZeneca. The third one is a protein-based vaccine. And a protein-based vaccine means you take a piece of the virus antigen and it's a subunit, and you introduce that, and it does the same thing. So the end game is the same. It's just how you elicit the body's response. That is the approach being used by a company, a small biotech here in the States called Novavax. And they just are about to enter human trials. And then the last one that I'll mention is called nucleic acid vaccines. And that's the one where we use genetic coding. So the difference in this one is we're not inserting into the body any part of the virus or the protein itself. We are actually inserting into the body an instruction manual through something called messenger RNA. And it is telling our bodies, hey, make this bad guy, make this antigen, because then your body's going to do what it's trained to do, which is make the antibody. And that type of vaccine is what Pfizer is working on in collaboration with a company in Germany called BioNTech.
Let's spend a little bit of time on that, because a big theme that has gone through our conversations has been innovate to accelerate. And there's some real advantages to the RNA approach that so many of us are hearing a lot about in terms of speed to solution, right?
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So the fact that what we're doing is the virus itself has had its genetic code written way back in January out of the work that was done in China. And so with that code, we are able to then quickly sequence the messenger RNA that is the directions to make that sequence. So basically, to some extent, you're reverse engineering it. You have the virus, you know what code it takes to make it. You then insert that code in the body makes it, and then the body reacts to it and makes the antibodies. So it's much faster. It allows you also, you don't have to grow the vaccine, you don't have to weaken the vaccine, you don't have to do you don't have to grow the virus, you don't have to weaken the virus, you don't have to use a subunit of the protein in the virus. You're actually just taking a little instruction book, writing it, and getting it done. Now, you can do it in a bunch of different ways, but it instead of taking months, perhaps, it can maybe take a week to generate an experimental batch of an RNA vaccine, of the instruction book that's going to go into your body to help your body make the antibodies.
One of the things we hear so much about that I think the RNA approach addresses is that it removes the risk of mutation, because, everybody talks about these viruses mutate, but when you get into the genetic coding, that eliminates some of that, right?
Well, this doesn't keep the virus from mutating, but it does mean that if the virus doesn't mutate, or if the virus did mutate, you could easily rewrite the code and come up with a new vaccine. So the example I like to use is when we hear about the flu vaccine every year and how much it matches the virus, because the flu virus is much more able to mutate. And it doesn't seem like this virus mutates much. So I don't want to, again, it looks like right now it's fairly stable, but should it mutate, an mRNA vaccine would be able to rewrite the code, fix something in the code, and come up with a more perfectly matched vaccine. So that's the other good thing about these mRNA vaccines. They can be quickly done, and they can be actually quickly altered as well.
So it's very agile technology.
Correct. That's what we're hoping.
Well, Pfizer really stepped up early. I mean, the partnership with BioNTech was very, very soon. It was on the scene. We heard about it in early January. And it's an interesting marriage, a huge global pharma and German startup. So tell us about that marriage and how it's working.
So actually, BioNTech is a company that Pfizer entered into a relationship with a couple of years ago on the messenger RNA platform with the goal of developing a better flu vaccine. Pfizer has a fairly robust vaccine division and a very, very, very well-known and well thought of R&D group. And they entered into a relationship with BioNTech because they are definitely a pioneer in mRNA technology. And they had been working for several years, even prior to our relationship, on perfecting these platforms for mRNA. We have a lot of great experience in both bacterial and viral vaccines within our R&D group, but not as much experience on the platform. So we started an arrangement with them working on a flu vaccine. When they realized that the sequencing of the COVID-19 virus was available and it could be translated to their mRNA vaccine, they actually picked up the phone and called our R&D head, who has been in contact with them. Their entire teams work seamlessly together across the two continents, and said, "Hey, would you be interested in working with us on a COVID vaccine?" And that is the beginning of the story that now is unfolding on our collaboration with BioNTech.
And is there a real difference in your approach versus other RNA approaches that other companies are taking?
There are not a lot of other companies that are as far along in the mRNA technology as we are with BioNTech. The only other vaccine that is in human trials with an mRNA platform is the Moderna product,
Right.
which I think many of you have heard of, but I can't really comment on the differences in the technology because I'm just not aware of that.
Well, the success criteria for all this is safety and effectiveness, right?
Yes.
So testing is paramount. And in this whole thing of innovate to accelerate, you've looked for ways to collapse the production time. You've also looked for ways to collapse the testing time. Do you want to talk a little bit about the traditional ways that vaccines used to be tested and how that pathway has changed?
Yeah, I would love to do that. And the one thing that I can say that I think is unique about the way our collaboration is working with BioNTech is we're actually testing four vaccine candidates simultaneously. So
Right.
what you'll hear in terms of the traditional approach for development of vaccines is it can be anywhere from a 10 to 15-year process from end to end, from the initial idea on how to invent it to the final approval and recommendation for use. What we're doing here is instead of doing things sequentially, which is what we tend to do to de-risk each stage, we're taking on all the risk up front, all of it. And we're doing almost everything we can at the same time. So whereas we normally would do tests on a group of volunteers, then we might reformulate and then do another test on a group of volunteers. That's why we've taken 4 different vaccines. We're testing them simultaneously on the volunteers, and we'll be continuing to move forward until we see 1 or 2 that we really think will provide the best level of safety and efficacy. And so that is allowing us to compress our time frame without cutting any corners. One thing I want to be really clear about, and I'm going to say this for our collaboration, and I'm going to speak on behalf of the industry that I've been privileged to represent. No one wants to cut corners with a vaccine. Everyone wants to do things as quickly as possible and to make sure that we're taking the right decisions at every step. We've just put a lot more people onto it. We're doing things a lot more quickly, and we're doing a lot more things at risk. We would never buy the raw materials to produce hundreds of millions of doses this early in the process, but we are, because if we're successful, we want to have as many doses available as soon as possible.
Sure. Let's then talk a little bit about efficacy standards, because again, while this search goes on, people are getting sick, seriously sick, dying.
Mm-hmm.
So when you used to think about what's the definition, the efficacy standard? Is it going to be a vaccine that works for the majority? Or is the approach also going to be more innovative, which is if we have something that saves many people, let's get it out there and refine it while we can build a version that then can save many, many more?
Yeah, and I think, it's all about this race to respond, Carolyn, and it's all about knowing that until there are vaccines, and I'm going to use a plural because this is not about competing with our colleagues. This is about
Sure.
collaborating to get as many possible vaccines out the door as quickly as possible, because no one company actually would be able to supply quickly what the world would need. So you are right, is that we are, while not sacrificing safety and efficacy, and all of the regulators we work with everywhere in the world have been very clear, and they've stated this publicly, no one is going to be allowed to cut corners. No one is going to be allowed to broadly use a vaccine that hasn't had the testing it needs. But how effective a vaccine is doesn't have anything to do with speed. It has to do with the design and the approach that you're taking. And so there have been situations where you have a vaccine that comes out and then someone has a better one, and then someone has a better one, and then someone has a better one. And that's what scientific innovation does. That's why we're also, again, trying to test 4 at the same time. So within even the suite of 4 candidates we're testing, if we see clearly a signal that one is the better one, we're going to try and speed that one much more quickly. So I think it's really critical for me to, I can't overstate the importance of safety and efficacy. We're not going to release a vaccine that is not efficacious, but we're also definitely not going to release a vaccine that is not safe.
Let's go back a little bit to a point you made earlier, which is finding the vaccine that works is just the beginning. Then there's the production aspect to it. There's the quality testing, this production of vials, syringes, stoppers, needles. And there was a great interview in Forbes just last week with your chairman that talked about Pfizer's commitment to these parallel actions that you were talking about, getting the production facilities done at the parallel pace of developing and researching the vaccine. This is really extraordinary for global pharma, isn't it?
It is. It is. And I'm very proud of Pfizer's position and very proud of our CEOs being out front on this. He's made it very clear that nothing else matters right now than getting this right. And, when he was asked, well, what if you fail? And he said, well, we're not going to fail. He has a strong belief, and I have to say, I give him a lot of credit for it, that we are going to do everything we can, and we're going to help the community around us do everything they can to get a viable, safe, and effective vaccine on the market and available to everyone that needs it as quickly as we can. It won't be day one, but we have a very sophisticated supply chain. We are looking at multiple ways to manage the manufacturing so we can get into the hundreds of millions of doses by sometime next year.
And you've already identified manufacturing sites, right?
We have several in the U.S. and one in Europe as well.
That's really extraordinary. Let's go back again to a point you made where there's not going to be just one vaccine probably, but there's also not one company that can meet global demand. So this has led to some unprecedented challenges and some unprecedented opportunities in collaboration between companies, hasn't it? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, and that's another thing that our CEO set out in his 5-point plan that we released well over a month ago, maybe 2 months ago now, realizing that we can't combat an unprecedented enemy with precedented techniques and tools. And so collaboration is the word of the day. And we have sponsored, and we are a part of several organizations that are sharing information on the disease, on what we know about it, what we know about its transmission rates, what we know about its severity, what we know about its genetic code, and some of the comments I made and you asked me about on mutations. Sure. We're in so many working groups, I couldn't name them all, but we're also collaborating on the manufacturing front. We've offered small and large companies capacity that we might have in some of our manufacturing sites to help speed their programs along. Something that you normally wouldn't see competitors do. We've sort of hung up a shingle. Almost every one of us has it somewhere in our home offices that says science will win. And we really believe that this is the time to prove that this is all about science.
So, summing up, all right, you are an optimistic person, I know that. So when we hear the reports and the hopes for a vaccine, an accessible vaccine by the end of the year or the first quarter of 2021, is that something you feel is really doable?
Yeah, I do. Because I don't think anyone is sleeping at night until we get there.
Well, good, because that's the answer we all want. So now let's move from the vaccine. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions in that area. But let's move from the area of vaccine to treatment, the development of antivirals. Pfizer, along with many other companies, is looking at how you can repurpose drugs already in your portfolio, or how you can develop new drugs to actually fight the virus before we have a vaccine. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Very important point. And obviously, the holy grail for infectious diseases is vaccines. The holy grail for any illness is the prevention of illness. But those don't grow on trees. And although there are literally over 100 candidates in different stages of development now, as of yesterday, 10 in clinical development, we also have to make sure that we have antivirals and treatments available. So everybody's heard a little bit about remdesivir in the news and how it has reduced hospitalization on average from 15 days to 11 days. Certainly 11 days sounds better than 15, but we'd like to do more than that. So we actually have a portfolio of antivirals at Pfizer, one of which we tested for the original SARS-CoV-1 vaccine back in the early 2000s. By the time we saw that it had good antiviral activity, that virus disappeared. It was eliminated. It's not circulating anymore. So we stopped the production on the development on that one. As soon as SARS-CoV-2 came through, our scientists, besides our vaccines teams, our antiviral team said, let's pull that off the shelf and test it again. And in fact, the early testing that we managed to do in February and March does show what looks like promising activity. So we are also racing to move this product into clinical testing, probably in the second half of the year, to see if we can bring that along also in an accelerated pace to have some options for bona fide viable therapies that can help patients that do contract this terrible disease.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about a point you also touched on earlier. In your role as president of emerging markets, this is a global problem. And no country will be safe until the world is safe from the COVID-19 virus. You can especially appreciate that there's some countries with very large, dense populations and underdeveloped healthcare systems. And those markets could be especially vulnerable to the virus and may not be able to have affordable access to vaccines. What steps are being taken, vaccines and treatment, what steps are being taken to assure affordable access for those markets?
Yeah, so again, another big pillar of what we're working on is we always do our jobs globally. Pfizer's been a global company for decades and decades, and I'm very proud of the stance that we've taken to make sure that we provide access to all of our medicines and vaccines around the world. So we are in conversations with multilateral organizations, the Gates Foundation, WHO, you name it, to make sure that as our vaccine becomes available, we have a mechanism to get it to those parts of the world where often it's quite difficult. And at this point, no contracts have been signed, nothing has been written in stone, but we have a seat at every one of those tables.
Okay, there's also another aspect, and I know this is a favorite subject of yours, the anti-vaxxers. One of the barriers to getting a vaccine implemented in marketplace is cultural resistance to it. And it's in emerging markets, but it's also right here in the US of A. Yeah. How do you deal with the challenge of anti-vaxxers, which clearly could present a real problem for eliminating COVID-19 as well as many, many other and future pandemics.
I guess it's to some extent it's the same way that I think we all think about dealing with the anti-maskers. Science is going to win here, and I really strongly believe that when we're faced with people that have questions about vaccines, we always answer them with data and with facts. We try very hard to not make this an emotional discussion, but an actual scientific discussion. And the data that will be generated will be the data that we will continue to use to convince people that don't believe in vaccines that it's time to start looking at the facts. It's a tough subject, Carolyn. It's a very emotional subject, and I know that for anyone that's suffered any kind of an injury from anything, a medicine, a vaccine, a brick falling off a building, you just don't want an accident to happen. So what we try and do is lead with our science, lead with our data, talk about our safety, talk about what we've done, and talk about the facts that the vaccines are a balance of safety and risk, just like any other intervention. But for the most part, vaccines are the most important thing we have been able to do for human public health after clean water that the world has ever seen. And I think for COVID-19, when we are all successful, I am hopeful that we will convert a few of the anti-vaxxers to be at least more approachable in terms of the need to vaccinate.
Great. Do you think we're winning this war so far?
I think that there is a lot more groundswell for the need for a vaccine, and people that probably wouldn't normally, I haven't done any research on this one, but I would guess that if you ask people if they could choose between a flu shot and a COVID-19 shot right now, almost anywhere in the world, I would like them to say, I don't want to choose, I'd like them both. But if they would choose, I bet you they'd choose COVID-19.
That's right.
So I think that the groundswell of interest in the vaccine will help us.
Okay, so we've talked about vaccines, we've talked about treatments, we've talked about overcoming resistance to vaccine. I'd like to touch a little bit on living with COVID for a while, because COVID could be around for a long time, and yet we are reopening economies around the world, and people are having to go back to work. So this goes back to one of the things you touched on in your role as leading the COVID-19 task force for Pfizer. What are the steps that you're concerned about in terms of managing and motivating a workforce while we have to live with COVID-19?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I said before, those principles of keeping people safe and healthy, but also making sure that they can be productive. And for us, that means looking at our population in different ways. If you're a lab scientist, it's very hard to work from home. But if you're a lab scientist and
Sure.
you're really driven by the discoveries that you want to make to further human medicine, then we're going to find a way to make sure that when you go back to your lab bench, you have all the right equipment, you are safe, we are taking care of your work location, we are making sure that it's clean, we are making sure that you're doing the appropriate social distancing. In our manufacturing sites, we have these big discs on the floor now that say, this is 6 feet from this, just like many of us have seen perhaps in grocery stores or other places when we've been out and about during the crisis.
Sure.
We have a pandemic plan that as a big company, we always have. And we have refreshed it based on what we know about COVID-19. So we are including mask wearing in all Pfizer locations. We're including hand washing instructions. We're actually also having all of our colleagues go through a training process before they return to site. So we know they've done the homework that they need to do to know what it takes to go back. So the new normal will be the new normal for a while, as you said, but we want people to feel safe and comfortable getting back to the office. So we have meeting policies, we have travel policies, we have guidelines on eating in the office. We have a very robust communications network. It only takes a crisis to figure out where the holes are in some of the things you thought you had. So we didn't even have a consolidated list of all the people who are our site leaders. It was done by function and by department and not by locale. So, a lot of things we've gotten better at through leading the crisis team.
Okay, before we go to Q&A, because I can see these things are coming in, let's continue on this leadership angle, which so many of our members can relate to. You are a top corporate leader responsible for thousands of employees around the world. Aside from the logistical problems, what new management challenges and motivational challenges have come as a result of the new ways of working imposed by COVID-19?
Well, I guess this is a really important topic, and I know everybody wants to talk about vaccines, and everybody wants to talk about when is this going to be over, and when are we going to go back to restaurants and theaters. But I think we will be forever changed by this, and I think that is true of leadership as well. I think for leaders who never knew much about their colleagues' home life, well, we're now looking at their houses every day,
Right.
and so you're learning to be a little bit more of a not just a professional, but a human professional, if you weren't one already. So I have someone that works for me who has 3 very young children, and they often wander into the room. And so I take 30 seconds to say hello to them. They jump on the beds behind her, and I call them her backup dancers. It's just, you have to sort of learn to be a little bit more in the moment and realize that you're going to have to flex maybe from the serious conversation you're having because someone's dog is barking in the back, or the FedEx guy is knocking at the door. I think the fact that there's a quote I like to use from Maya Angelou that I'm sure many of you have used as well, which is they'll forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget the way you made them feel. And so I think leadership right now is people feeling supported, feeling understood, understanding that they're vulnerable. As one of the members of my task force said, he said, and this was very early on, he said, we're going to have people in our community that are going to lose loved ones to this disease. And we hadn't even conceived of the magnitude of some of the numbers we're seeing here in the United States, which are horrific.
Sure.
But he was right. And I can't tell you how many colleagues have lost family members during this time, despite everything that you've done to keep people safe. So I think it's about shifting your culture to make sure that you accept the fact that people have a 360-degree view of their teams, being more flexible in terms of working remotely when you can. I gave the example of the lab scientist. I could give the example of the manufacturing operator. They can't do that from their kitchen. So how can we make sure that they can stay proud about what they're doing, but they feel as safe as they were when they were not able to go to the manufacturing site? So it's going to be a lot about empathy. It's going to be a lot about commitment and connection. It's not going to be a lot about the old school command and control, which I've never been a big believer in, only when you need it. And it's going to be a lot about connection and collaborating. That's what it's going to be.
It's ironic, isn't it, that this period of isolation has in a way made us all more human?
Yes, exactly.
And made it even more important than ever. Before we go to questions, I'd like to wrap up this amazing conversation with one in the lessons learned area. The truth is, we're still learning more and more about this virus every day. Some days it's, you can't touch anything. Then it's not so much transmitted by touch. Then it's, masks are necessary. Everybody has to wear a mask.
Right.
And we still have so much more to learn. Many people felt the world was caught unprepared for this pandemic, despite warnings from scientists and NGOs. And this isn't going to be the last pandemic, is it? So what do you think we've learned from this experience that will leave us better prepared for the next one?
It's my fervent belief that if the world doesn't come together around the power of collaboration and cooperation and supporting each other, regardless of what we do and where we live, we will have lost a huge opportunity in human history. Huge. And I believe that it'll be through leadership. It'll be through actions, not just words. It will be through how you make people feel. And so doing the right thing to me has never been more important.
That's terrific. Amazing conversation. Susan, thank you so much for this. And I'd like to now go to questions from our global audience, and I think they're going to pop up. And if they will, I will read them to you.
Okay.
Okay. Here's a question from Karen Duckett, who did not give her forum, but it says COVID-19 is affecting persons of color more than any other race group to date. In testing, do you sample all races to see the impact of vaccine and not just a homogeneous population? That's an issue of scope.
Yeah, it's a great question. And we actually have a dedicated group of individuals at Pfizer that look at diversity in our clinical trial population. For a long time, Karen, it was not just African Americans, but it was females overall. Very few females in clinical trials versus males. So we started out on a gender lens, but we've added also an ethnic lens. So I can't tell you numbers today for our trials because I don't have them, but I know we have continued to have a focus on that. And I don't believe we would let that stop for our COVID-19 programs. Thank you for the question.
We have a question from Usha Raj, which has been tempered a little bit. She says, since you're not an immunologist, is it not, it's about the collapsing of the testing timetable. How can you cut short the rigorous testing that is needed before you release a vaccine and have confidence in it? A perfect example is the antibody tests that were released without adequate testing, which are turning out to be 50% false positive.
Yeah. So the good news here on this one is we're not going to release anything without regulatory reviews. So the FDA, the European Medicine Agency, Health Canada, whatever country we're going to be getting this product approved, this vaccine approved, it will have some level of regulatory review. Now, there are fast track regulatory reviews. There are emergency use approvals. But they will have reviewed the data, and it seems that we all the companies working on vaccines are working together with the FDA to come up with a way for them to almost review the data in real time. It's called the reduction of whitespace, which means that normally we would gather all the evidence, take a few weeks, write it up, copy edit it, and then publish it for the FDA to review. What we're going to try and do is not make all the bells and whistles, like here's the data, we're looking at it, you look at it. Here's the data, we're looking at it, you look at it. So again, I want to just be clear, we are not cutting corners, and no one is going to release a vaccine for broad use without completing all of the relevant pieces.
Okay, there's quite a few questions here from various people about costs. So I'm going to try and lump them together. And it says, can you speak to the costs of doing all of these steps and in parallel? And again, I know in the article in Forbes last week, it talked about $1 billion commitment by Pfizer. Is the US and other governments supporting Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies in these efforts?
Well, I think different companies are doing it differently. I know our CEO has stated that, we're about to spend $1 billion. And whether we get a vaccine or not, we don't know, but we're going to spend $1 billion. And if we lose it, we lose it. But he has no intention, as he tells us every day, of losing it. So different companies have gone through different ways of getting funding. Right now, the funding for the Pfizer-BioNTech program is coming from the companies and not from the governments. But I think that the industry as a whole is fairly clear that this is the time for us to do what we do best, which is bringing science to the service of public health. And so the cost is not the primary factor in any decision being made.
Okay, there's a few questions also that have clustered together on leadership. And I think this one is very interesting for this webinar. Why do you think women have made much better leaders in this COVID crisis. Much has been written about this. As a woman leader, what is your insight?
Wow, this is a topic I've worked on for a good chunk of my career, and been involved in a number of different groups, including this one. I sometimes bristle at the concept of female leadership. I don't understand why the word leader has to have a gender adjective in front of it. But if it does,
I agree.
Let's figure out what it could mean. And I really do believe, and I said the words before, it's sort of words I use in one of the speeches I've given on leadership and the difference between male characteristic leadership and female characteristic leadership. And I do believe that women are connectors and collaborators. That's what we do best. That must be somewhere wired in our genetic code primarily. I have worked for women who are command and control, which I think is more of a male trait. And I have worked for men who are much more connect and collaborate, which I think is a more female trait. But I do believe in this case, and many of us have probably read the article about the women world leaders who seem to have managed this crisis much better than
Right.
countries with male leaders. I do believe that we are not afraid to ask questions. We're not afraid to ask for help. We actually thrive in groups. We thrive in pinging off of each other. And I think that's where my comment on connecting and collaborating seems to ring true for women leaders on a majority basis, and command and control seems to be more a male concept. Now, there are times when you just have to take the ball and run with it, and you're going to command and control because you've got to. And so I've never, ever want to say that that's a bad leadership trait. I just think in times like this where information is flying around fast and furious, it's networks like this that get you the most information. It's not keeping things in a little box and focusing just on what you know and going straight ahead. So although I work for a company that has a lot of competitors, I like to see this, and I think my company sees this as the chance to collaborate, not compete.
There's quite a few questions here in the area of communications. How you communicate with people to effectively promote the kind of behavior that could lead to mitigation, proper masks, mask wearing, conduct, social distancing, and the kind of communication that can help make people more receptive to vaccines when they come. Is there a special part of your task force that is focused on communication?
It's interesting that you asked the question, because right now most of our communication around this is focused inward to Pfizer to make sure, again, we have 90,000 colleagues around the world that we're trying to keep healthy and safe and allow them to do their jobs and achieve their goals to bring new medicines and vaccines to patients all over the world. But we also have started to work on our external communications. Many of you may have read the Pfizer 5-point plan. You might have read the Forbes interview with our CEO that just came out last week. And we are working on trying to make this, and I know our CEO pretty well. We want to make this digestible. I gave you guys maybe a little bit more science than you were expecting today. I just happen to love it. But I want people to understand that it is the science that's driving all of this. And so we want people to know that it's grounded in hard facts. It's not, we didn't just dream it up. Although I do think that the people that work on any new invention are inventors. They are creating something from nothing, but the nothing is based on basic scientific knowledge. So I'd love feedback, however we get it, Carolyn, from the forum on even the way I was explaining things. Is that digestible for people that aren't in the field? Is that something you could turn around and tell your family members at dinner or at lunch or tomorrow at breakfast? Hey, wow, I heard this person talk about vaccines. Did you know? That's what I want us to get to, and that's what we're really striving for. So yeah, we're working hard at that.
I think I've got a good final question here from Georgia, the IWF Georgia chapter, which is again about leadership and about collaboration. It says many of us are on public company boards, and I agree we need more collaboration. Can you talk a bit more from a leadership perspective about how boards can enable collaboration?
That's a really good question. I do not yet sit on a public board, but I do sit on the Gavi Alliance board, which brings together all sorts of public health actors and governments from around the world. And, I think that's a perfect example of how boards actually have to put the problem at hand in the middle of the room and then take off their constituency hats. That's a Geneva term they use, their constituency hats, and focus on, in this case for Gavi, we're focused on getting vaccines to the children in the 73 poorest countries of the world at the same time we get them in the developed world. And so we're constantly reminding each other to respect the position we come from, but to focus on the kids that need the vaccine. And so I think from any board's perspective that I could imagine, that's really the matter at hand. What are we trying to give advice to? What are we trying to solve? And the good news is most boards, well, I'd like to think all boards, but many boards are diverse. They have people with different backgrounds that come with different experiences. And I think that if the goal is, what's the problem we're all trying to solve? Let's have that conversation so that we're not just coming at it from a fold your arms, this is my angle and this is what I want to see. So that's sort of that's how I would put it.
I think we may have time for one more, and this has popped up, and it has to do again with the global aspect of it and how we monitor the development of this disease in various countries, which I'm sure you're doing through the task force and through your role in emerging markets. But this is perfect to your emerging markets role, and it has to do with what we can learn from the spread of the virus in Africa. It appears to be different than it's spread on other continents. Caveat, if it's not solely due to a difference in reporting disciplines.
Right.
Do you think it's due to the difference in reporting, or do you think there is a difference in the spread across continents that you've seen so far?
I think right now, and I think someone said it earlier, the issue with testing and the validity of these tests makes it hard for me to comment on whether there's a genetic difference in an African in South Africa versus an African American in Georgia versus an Italian in Milan. So right now, until we have a more baseline good sense of the validation of some of the tests, I think it would be hard to say. It's the same question we've gotten about climate, right? Do we think in warm weather the disease is going to go away? Hard to say. We don't know that yet. We don't have enough evidence. Certainly, as Beijing and most of China has come out of the winter into the summer, the disease seems to be waning. But Latin America is going into winter. So Southern Latin America, my colleagues in Brazil are in the kind of lockdown mode that we all were in a month ago, everywhere in the United States. So again, I hate to not be able to answer any question, but I think I can just say that the jury is out on it, but it's something that the world's best epidemiologists, I mean best, are looking at this and collaborating as much as they can to try and unlock these differences.
Well, I'd just like to say, Susan, again, thank you for this amazing conversation. We focused on wrapping up by 1 o'clock, and the last few questions that rolled up were said, thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been informative, and this has been amazing. So on behalf of the Women's Forum of New York and IWF, thank you so much for all of the effort that's gone into developing this webinar today. I know it's been informative for all of us. And I know we'd all like to express our thanks to all of the healthcare workers that are fighting COVID on the front line everywhere around the world. This truly is a global challenge and a perfect challenge to be addressed by IWF today. Thank you, and thank you to everyone around the world who joined us on this IWF webinar.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day and stay safe and healthy. Wash your hands. Wear a mask.
Stay safe.